Mark chapter 15 opens at dawn, the same morning as Jesus' late night trial. By now, he has been betrayed, arrested, beaten, and dragged through an illegal trial that ended before sunrise. The religious leaders finally have what they want, but not what they need, because they don't have the authority to kill him. Rome does. And convincing Rome to kill an innocent man is no small task. Good morning, and welcome back to The Late Disciple. As Mark tells us of Jesus' final hours, he removes some of Matthew's dramatic details. There's no story of Judas hanging himself, no account of priests securing the tomb. Instead, Mark gives us something else, a fast-moving, eyewitness-style narrative that feels urgent, raw, and unfiltered. And he includes details Matthew doesn't. This is the day Jesus is crucified. One chapter, 47 verses. The darkest moment in human history. The sun is barely cresting over Jerusalem when the religious leaders bind Jesus and deliver him to Pilate. His bindings aren't necessary. Jesus surrendered willingly. But binding him creates a theatrical impression, a dangerous man, a threat, and this is precisely the false picture they need Rome to see. Under Roman law, the Sanhedrin can accuse people, but they can't execute them. So, Jesus is delivered under a new charge, insurrection, not blasphemy. Blasphemy means nothing to Rome. But a rival king, a man claiming a throne, that demands Rome's attention. And this is where Mark differs from Matthew. Matthew pauses his narrative to tell us Judas hangs himself. Mark doesn't. Mark keeps us tightly focused on the transfer of authority, the religious establishment handing Jesus into the machinery of imperial justice. He keeps the focus on Jesus. But we're going to change our focus for a moment, not to talk about Judas, but Pontius Pilate. Who was the Roman governor of Judea? Territories conquered by the empire were overseen by governors, administrators appointed to keep order, collect taxes, and maintain loyalty to Caesar. Judea was not a prize assignment. It was politically volatile, religiously complex, and generally considered a posting for officials who were either on their way up from nothing or on their way down. Pontius Pilate became the fifth man to hold that office, serving as governor for 11 years. This unusually long assignment might sound like stability, but not for Pilate. Many scholars note a career filled with corruption, incompetence, and a ruthlessness that was considered extreme, even by Roman standards. Rome had nowhere else for him except dismissal. And that's exactly what ultimately happened when Emperor Caligula abruptly dismissed him and removed him from public office altogether. This is the Pontius Pilate who asks Jesus a question Rome takes very seriously. Are you the king of the Jews? Now, depending on your translation of the Bible, Jesus' answer sounds either vague or crystal clear. In the ESV, NIV, and other translations, Jesus responds, "You have said so." But the New King James Version, NASB, and some other translations read, "It is as you say," which removes the ambiguity entirely. And this is true of Matthew's Gospel as well. Either way, Jesus isn't denying the title. He's acknowledging it, though not in the way Pilate imagines. Pilate is amazed at Jesus' silence. Every other prisoner brought before him pleads for mercy, argues their case, or insists on their innocence. Jesus does none of these things. He stands quietly, absorbing every accusation without resistance. Pilate has never seen anything like this, and Mark wants us to feel Pilate's bewilderment. Every year during Passover, as a symbolic gesture of goodwill, Pilate releases a prisoner chosen by the crowd. And this year, he offers them a choice between Jesus and a notorious criminal named Barabbas. He thinks this is an easy win for him because he's pretty much made up his mind that Jesus is only guilty of being hated by local religious leaders, and Barabbas was guilty of crimes, including rebellion. Working at cross purposes, though, the religious leaders worked the crowds in an attempt to favor the release of Barabbas. An interesting note here. As we pointed out in our discussion of the healing of the blind man, Bartimaeus, in Mark chapter 10, Bar means son of. So, Bartimaeus translates to son of Timaeus. Therefore, the criminal, Barabbas, would translate to son of Abbas. Now, remember Jesus praying to Abba in Gethsemane? Yes, the crowd is choosing between the son of a human father and the son of the Father. And they choose a violent insurrectionist over the Prince of Peace. Matthew includes a dream from Pilate's wife warning him not to harm Jesus. Mark leaves it out. Matthew also records Pilate washing his hands to absolve himself of guilt. Mark leaves that out as well. Mark's focus isn't on Pilate's conscience, it's on the crowd's choice and the leader's manipulation. Pilate knows Jesus is innocent. He knows the chief priests are acting out of envy. But political pressure wins. The crowd stirred into a frenzy, and Pilate, afraid of another riot, gives in. Barabbas is released, and Jesus is handed over to be crucified. Jesus is taken into the governor's headquarters, where he is first scourged or flogged, and then mocked. The scourging process was so brutal that many victims died from this before a sentence of crucifixion could be carried out. But Jesus survives. Then, surrounded by a cohort of soldiers, the mockery begins. This isn't a half dozen or so soldiers, but potentially 200 or more, a garrison. They drape a robe over his open wounds. They twist a crown of thorns and press it into his scalp. They salute him with fake reverence. They strike him, spit on him, and kneel in sarcastic worship. Matthew says the robe was scarlet, the color of a Roman soldier's cloak. Mark says the robe was purple, the color of royalty. Is Mark stylizing the detail for his Roman audience? Perhaps. But the point stands. Even in mockery, the soldiers unknowingly proclaim a truth greater than they understand. Contrary to popular belief, prisoners didn't carry their cross. That would be too heavy for even the healthiest man. Instead, they carried the crossbeam, the horizontal portion of the cross. But Jesus is now too weak to carry his. So, the soldiers compel a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, to carry it for him. And here Mark adds a detail that Matthew doesn't. Simon is the father of Alexander and Rufus. These were likely known members of the early Christian community. It's Mark's subtle way of saying, if you want to verify this story, talk to their sons. At Golgotha, Jesus is offered wine mixed with myrrh, a sedative intended to dull pain. The Romans offered this to victims who were about to be crucified to temporarily ease the initial pain of being nailed to the cross. This was almost certainly not a humanitarian act. It was more likely to save the soldiers the inconvenience of wrestling with men struggling in their excruciating agony. Matthew says the wine was mixed with gall as opposed to myrrh. Different ingredients, same purpose. But Jesus refuses. He chooses full consciousness for the suffering ahead. I've described both the scourging and the crucifixion process in detail in my Matthew chapter 27 video, and that was sufficiently disturbing for me that I don't want to do it again. Mark also chooses not to include sensational detail in his description of the crucifixion. Mark doesn't need it. His audience knows exactly what crucifixion means. And as Jesus hangs there, the mockery continues, from passers-by, from chief priests, even from those crucified beside him. They say, "Save yourself," but he is saving others. This is the paradox of the cross. At noon, the sky goes dark for 3 hours. In the ancient world, even a brief solar eclipse caused terror, but 3 hours? The city must have felt swallowed by judgment. And then Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Not in pain. This is the moment in which Jesus is separated from God for the first time in his life, as God pours out his wrath on him as the substitute for all sinners. He didn't slowly die on the cross after days of suffering like so many. His shout to God shows us his astonishing strength even in the light of the suffering he'd endured. As he breathes his last breath, he voluntarily gives up his own life. The temple curtain tears in two, from top to bottom, from God to man, not man to God. And the centurion, a hardened military officer responsible for 100 soldiers, watches Jesus die. He's never witnessed the demonstrated strength of a man dying on the cross on his own terms, and he says, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." The first human confession of Jesus' divine identity at the cross comes from a Gentile soldier. As evening approaches, Joseph of Arimathea steps forward. Mark tells us Joseph was a respected member of the council, something Matthew doesn't mention. Mark also tells us that he approached Pilate with courage to ask for the body of Jesus. This was indeed an act of courage for more than one reason. First, as one of the Sanhedrin, Joseph was inviting the ire and potential retribution of the others of the council who had orchestrated Jesus' death. Secondly, those who were crucified weren't given to their families for burial. As criminals, they were taken down and taken to Gehenna, a garbage dump outside of Jerusalem. Sometimes they were left on the cross until their bodies decayed and decomposed as a deterrent to potential criminals. And lastly, Pilate was likely in no mood to even talk to someone from the religious council, as they had just circumvented his will. When he does see Joseph, he's surprised to learn that Jesus is already dead, and he asks a centurion to confirm this before making a decision. It was common for the crucified to suffer for days before finally succumbing to dehydration, exposure, or hunger. Once Joseph secures permission, he makes an effort to give Jesus a proper burial, wrapping him in fine linen. He didn't have time to anoint his body with spices according to custom because the Sabbath was quickly approaching. So, the body is placed in the tomb is sealed, and the women who witness the crucifixion witness the entombment. Mark ends the chapter here. There's no reference to the priests asking for guards to be posted at the tomb. Again, Jesus is the focus, and Mark is setting up the glorious and shocking conclusion of chapter 16. Mark chapter 15 presents the crucifixion with stark simplicity. Where Matthew adds detail, drama, and prophetic fulfillment, Mark strips the story down to movement, quick, direct, unembellished. And yet, in that simplicity, Mark delivers profound clarity. Jesus is rejected by Israel, condemned by Rome, mocked by soldiers, misunderstood by the crowds, abandoned by his disciples, and killed between criminals. But through it all, he remains king. He remains in control. He fulfills Scripture, embraces suffering, refuses shortcuts, and willingly offers himself as a ransom for many. The chapter ends where all hope seems lost, but only for a moment. Mark has one more chapter to go, and resurrection is drawing near. Thank you for spending part of your day with me. If this message brought you hope, clarity, or peace, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need it today. Until next time, walk in grace, live with purpose, and keep your heart open to His call. And as always, remember, we are all disciples. It is never too late.